Hi, this is Dr. Terry Lay, and I'm on the YouTube channel What's Wrong with the World and How to Fix It. And this YouTube is on Marx's theory of class. So, like in this YouTube, on this video I'm going to talk about Marx's theory of class, and in the next video I'll critique it, or at least I'll explore it in more detail in terms of the way I look at things. But this is a really kind of general introduction to Marx's theory of class. Marx's theory of class is scattered in various writings, so there's no place where he actually explains it all in detail, consequentially, as it were. So, you know, Capital Volume 1, in terms of what might be easy to read, Wage, Labour and Capital is really good. Also, the Communist Manifesto. Other writings that are relevant are the German ideology, particularly relevant. Another set of writings which is often called the pre-capitalist economic formations, or the Grundrisse, or whatever. And then his early writings, the Paris manuscripts, or the early writings as they're sometimes called. These kind of writings by Marx on class are assembled, as it were, by Marxists and by people of socialists. So a good person to read, and I'll also refer to him, is Ernest Mandel, a Belgian Trotskyist, quite, you know, like, I don't know, wrote in the 60s, 70s and so on. Gordon Childe is an anthropologist or archaeologist, whatever. You know, so there are various people who have interpreted Marx's theory of class in pretty much the way I'm about to do. Okay, so a class in Marx's theory is a transfer of a material surplus product. This surplus product is produced by the subordinate class, like that could be peasants or the working class or whoever, you know, slaves, whatever. And it's appropriated, you know, like taken over, owned, come to be owned by the ruling class, which could be, you know, landlords, the king, you know, a noble elite, or the capitalist class, or whatever. The ruling classes own the means of production. So what are the means of production? They're the means by which things are produced, material things are produced, or things are produced that are necessary to people. So, you know, obviously in ancient societies, things like land is part of the means of production. Also forests and mines for tin, things like that are necessary to produce goods and services. In modern capitalist society, it's factories, but also probably banks and God knows what anyway. The ownership of the means of production, or, you know, like, it really means control, or the control of the means of production gives the ruling class various ways of exerting leverage over the subordinate class. In other words, you don't get access to food and housing and your material necessities and your life unless you produce goods and services, because the ruling class controls the means of producing these things. I mean, that's very variable in a way, because, like, it doesn't mean ownership in a sort of narrow legal sense, which only exists in capitalism anyway, but it means ownership is a sense of control. So in an ancient slave society, slaves themselves are owned, but in order to get access to food and so on, they have to do the work that their owner requires them to do, and then some of what they produce goes to the owner, and some of what they produce, like food, etc., they eat themselves. Marx refers to the hours worked to produce what the worker or peasant gets for their own use as necessary labour. In other words, necessary to create their subsistence. And the hours worked to produce what the ruling class appropriates, he refers to as surplus labour. So the stuff that surplus labour produces, he calls a surplus product. So, okay, so let's look at it in terms of a society like the slave societies of the Caribbean. Okay, so say the family lives on a little plot of land. On the weekends, they work in their own gardens to produce the food from that. That's necessary labor. And then in the other part of the week, you know, like 3 or 4 days a week or whatever it might be, 5 days a week, they work on the slave owner's land to produce either food or in the case of many of one Caribbean island that I visited, salt. You know, like, okay, so that's the surplus product, which is going to and is appropriated by the ruling class. So now I'm going to read a few quotes from Marx just to give you a flavour of what he says when he's writing about this stuff, just to explain this theory further. So he says here, capital has not invented surplus labour. Wherever a part of society possesses a monopoly of the means of production. So notice how he uses the term monopoly of the means of production rather than ownership. He means basically control over the means of production. The labourer, free or not free, must add to the working time necessary for his, like, so Marx always uses his as a sort of generic he, which is very patriarchal, but anyway, his own maintenance and extra working time in order to produce the means of subsistence for the owners of the means of production. Whether this proprietor be the Athenian nobleman, the Etruscan theocrat, the civis Romanus, okay, meaning the Roman citizen, the elite in Rome, the Norman baron, you know, like the, you know, in medieval times, the American slave owner, the Wallachian boyard, Wallachia is a part of Romania and so on, the boyards like the nobility of their area, the modern landlord or capitalist. So free or not free. Okay, so what does he mean by that? Okay, so peasants and slaves were in a sense not free. Peasants not free to go somewhere else to another landlord. They have to stick with the landlord they've been assigned, as it were. And the same is true of the slave. Obviously, they're not free. Whereas the modern labourer of capitalist societies is free. They can offer their labour power on the market and move from one capitalist to another. This is like an invention, a new thing in capitalist class societies compared to other older class societies. Okay, I'll move on. And now this is what do class societies have in common? I've got a few quotes on this. And so he says, 3 days surplus labour in the week remain 3 days that yield no equivalent to the labourer himself, whether it be called corvée or wage labour. Corvées are called compulsory work done for the landlord in certain societies, and Marx is talking about that there, and he's saying that the labourer gets nothing out of this, the landlord has complete control over it, and wage labour it's the same. I'll come back to that, how he explains how wage labour also involves producing a surplus product that the worker doesn't get. What class societies have in common again? This life activity sells to another person in order to secure the necessary means to enable subsistence, to enable him to exist. So that's because, like, he's talking about a capitalist society there, and he's saying, okay, so the reason why you've got to work is you've got to work to get money. Why have you got to get money? Because you don't own the means of production. You've got no way of supplying yourself with the goods and services you need to live. So what do you have to do? You have to put your labour power on the market and sell it in order to get money, in order to eat, and so on. And he would apply that to any society. So like I said, you know, in a slave society, you don't get access to food unless you do what the owner tells you. In a peasant society, you know, they'll send in knights in armour to ensure that you provide a certain amount of tribute to the Lord, so you don't get access to anything. You'll be killed by the knights in armour if you don't behave properly. Okay, so capitalism is a class society. So I'm going to read out this. This is like somewhat complex, but not that. I'll explain it. The portion of the working day then during which reproduction takes place, meaning how does the labour reproduce themselves fit for work the next day, right? They buy things on the market and then, you know, eat food and live in houses and so on, right? That's reproduction. I call necessary labour time, necessary for reproduction, in other words. And the labour expended during that time, I call necessary labour. This is Marx speaking. During the second period of the labour process, the workman labours, but he creates no value for himself. he creates surplus value, which for the capitalist has all the charms of a creation out of nothing. Okay, so what he means by that is like, okay, so say it's a 6 hour, well, let's say it's an 8 hour day, right? First 4 hours, you're working and you're producing monetary value, right? This is the key part of capitalist societies. You're producing monetary value in that time, and that's the monetary value you get paid in your wage, right? There it is, 4 hours. 4 hours of work you've produced for the capitalist, all this monetary value, which happens to be the same as your wage, right? That's the first 4 hours, necessary labor. Right, what's the next 4 hours? Okay, so the next 4 hours you're still working and you're still producing monetary value for the capitalist, but you don't get paid any of that money. The capitalist gets it all, right? So that's the surplus labor. That produces the monetary, you know, like as money, like how much does that count as money? That's called surplus value. So notice how Marx makes this change then. He uses the term surplus product to refer to things like tribute, where the peasant gives a certain number of bags of wheat to the landlord, whatever, that's tribute, right? That's a surplus product. And now he uses the term surplus value to apply to capitalist societies. In other words, what he's saying is these kinds of class societies operate in the same way, but in a sense in capitalist society, this is mystified. Like it's not that apparent, you know, like you go to work and it's fair day's work for a fair day's pay. You offer your labor power and you get paid back what the labor power must be worth. But actually he says it's worth a lot more than you get paid. It's worth a lot more in money. He gives us an example, a farmer, like a capitalist farmer in other words, who employs a day labourer for 5 silver groschen and makes 10 silver groschen. So the costs the capitalist farmer, he's paying out 5 groschen for the day's work, but the money that he's making when he sells like the wheat or whatever it is 10 silver groschen. So he's making an extra 5 silver groschen of money. That's surplus value. Now, this extra money not only produces the wealth of the capitalist, like as income, you know, as trips to Sweden or whatever, you know, like all that stuff, you know, holidays in the Costa Rica or whatever. No, what it also does is it increases the capital of the capitalist owner. Okay, so he can put some of that money back. And so Marx writes, the worker not only replaces what he consumes, meaning he consumes like money. He not only makes as much money as he takes away in his wage, but gives to the accumulated labour a greater value than it previously possessed. So, okay, so the accumulated labour is like the means of production, you know, like machinery and so on. He's giving it that more value, but also in the terms of the products, you know, like he's producing cars and so on and so on. So at the beginning of the day, all of these bits and pieces and so on had a certain amount of monetary value. At the end of the day, it's a car. It's got more monetary value. There you go. So note the shift. I've said this already, but I'm going to repeat it. The shift in terminology between pre-capitalist class societies and capitalism. Surplus product is the term used for any class society, including capitalist societies by implication. And I don't know whether he actually says that. But surplus value is only used to refer to capitalism where it's got a monetary form. Okay, so I want to say something about that. Okay, this is my theory of money. Well, look, I have a sort of credit theory of money, which is similar to a Nietzsche Nelson, if you want to read anyone on this stuff. Okay, what money does is give you a claim in the marketplace on goods and services, right? So what that means, if you have a certain amount of money, you have a certain capacity to access goods and services. Now, this amounts, in terms of the theory of human nature, this amounts to a kind of autonomy. You've got the power to choose the things that are available to you on the market, you know, with $100, right? So if you've got more money, like you've got $200, it means you've got more autonomy in the sense that you've got more capacity to access goods and services that are available on the market. All right, that's why there's a similarity between surplus product, you know, meaning like a bag of wheat or whatever, and surplus value, because surplus value is a monetary thing. And what it actually boils down to in terms of human needs is autonomy. The capitalist has more capacity to access the work done by other people that's available on the market, the products of that work that's available on the market, than you do with your pay packet. All right? Now, what I'm going to do now is talk about Mandel. Okay, Mandel, as I said, he creates a synthesis of Marxist writings. He's a Trotskyist writer, right? And I said all this already. But anyway, he has an explanation of the origins of social class, which I'm going to talk about in the next talk. But basically, it's quite consistent with Marx's writings, like in the German ideology, I'm thinking, for a start, also in pre-capitalist economic formations and so on, and in other places. So, all right, so here we go. And I've got this divided into A, B, and C. Sorry. A, where one person can only produce enough for their own subsistence, there can be no social division into classes. All right, that makes a certain amount of sense. Okay, so we have a level of technology and productive capacity. We work hard all day, and we get a certain amount of things from that, a certain amount of food, and so on, and we can't produce any more. I mean, God, we've worked all day and we're still only producing enough for ourselves to eat. That's the hypothesis, right? I'm going to exercise very critical lens on these ideas next week. But anyway, so in terms of Marx's writing, he refers to this as primitive communism or tribal societies or something like that. And he's aware of the anthropology being conducted in the 19th century. And this makes this concept quite believable, you know, like that these societies were communal, that they shared goods in common, and so on. And they and clearly, well, what Marx and Mandel is attributing to Marx, and what Marx thought, was that these societies were simple societies because they couldn't produce any more than one person could eat. You know, like one person couldn't produce any more than they could actually eat themselves and look, you know, build their own dwellings and so on. And in terms of the terms that we would now use, we probably talk about these as indigenous societies or classless societies, as I have in previous talks. B, the second point, an increase in productivity beyond this low point sets the conditions for a struggle about how this surplus will be shared. Okay, so now the person is producing more in their day than they can possibly use themselves for their bare subsistence. Right, okay, so agriculture is clearly the factor that Mandel and Marx are thinking about in this. Okay, so with the advent of agriculture, what they're saying is you can plow a field with wheat and so on, and it grows up. No, this is a new level of technological productivity. You can produce more wheat in a day's work, you know, averaged out over the whole year, than you can possibly eat yourself. So there's a surplus, right? You produce, what are we going to do with all this extra wheat? And so this can lead to a struggle. Some people try to work less, you know, because work's a burden, you know, like, and they work less, and they take the wheat other people have produced, right? So a section of society, this is number C, right? A section of society can become a ruling class which is released from the necessity to work to produce their own subsistence. So this is the origin of class societies. Once agriculture has been established, a surplus can be produced. There's a struggle to gain control of this surplus, and the ruling class is whichever group in whichever particular historical situations manage to do that. And once they've done that, they don't have to work. The surplus product comes to them being produced by other people, and they're appropriating that surplus product. And of course, how do they manage to pull off this trick? They pull off this trick by gaining control of land or forests or whatever the means of production are. basically, I mean, whatever way you look at it, the ruling class employs a class of armed retainers, you know, like an army, or they themselves are the ruler, are armed and the rest of the population is comparatively unarmed and unable to resist, and they are forced to produce a surplus. And in a sense, you know, like, I mean, I totally buy this, that even capitalist society operates like this. Like you know, as a consumer and presumably, and in many cases, a working class in an affluent first world country, or a middle class person in any country of the world, you know, you don't actually own the means of production. You know, at the end of the day, you've got to get some means of getting income in order to live. Right, so like the basic means of production to produce houses and to produce, you know, heating in winter, and to produce food for that's the most important thing, are owned by the capitalist class. You know, like, you know, the 1% or whatever. Okay, so that's still true in a capitalist society today. You are still, your arm is twisted. There is leverage placed on you to do work for the capitalist ruling class, just like in any other class society. Okay, now I'm going to go for Marx's optimistic conclusion. So this is only like a throwaway couple of lines in the German ideology. I don't know if he says it anywhere else, but it's certainly important, and it certainly follows from the theory of class I've just explained. A communist society becomes possible again in the future. Right, so we've got primitive communism in the past, right? Well, of course, not in the past. When Europeans were going around the world, there were still many examples of it. But anyway, it becomes possible again in the future. Why? This is the stage when production is sufficiently advanced to produce abundance. In other words, with modern capitalism, and I'll talk about why Marx thinks that happens in a later talk. But anyway, with modern capitalism, society becomes much more productive with manufacturing and machine manufacture and so on. And consequently, what we have is not just a small surplus like bags of wheat or whatever. We have a vast surplus of things that people don't actually need, which is being produced. This abundance means that it doesn't matter how mad your desires are and so on, there's actually no point in fighting over the surplus. You might as well share it. I mean, the energy expended in fighting to control all of this surplus becomes counterproductive, right? So even members of the ruling class, you know, you might think they're doing extremely well, but really, you know, like, well, I won't talk about everything that's going wrong for them at the moment, but in any event, what they're getting out of using their extra wealth is minimal compared with what's possible for the vast bulk of society, given this abundance, if it was evenly shared and kind of people cooperated to create abundance. So that's Marx's optimistic communist vision, and again, you know, you might have a few qualms about that, and I'll probably talk about them in a later talk. So next week I'm going to explore this theory in more detail and show how there's a sort of humanist assumptions being made about human nature and stuff that actually interpenetrate this analysis and make it in some ways more similar or more analogous to the analysis of gender inequality that I've talked about before, you know, in terms of the surplus of pleasures and satisfactions as against the disadvantages of frustrations of desire and so on, that actually you can read that kind of humanist interpretation into Marx's theory. So that's for next week.